Okay, so good morning again. Last week, I tried to cram a lot into the shiur, but if I will give a title to what I discussed last week, it was the decline of halachic, legislative, executive, and judicial and legislative institutions throughout history. And what I put across is the fact that these institutions began to decline even before Churban Habayit, and their decline continued way after Churban Habayit up to even our days. Now, today I want to put more meat on that bone and to actually show it in some sources. So I could have discussed a lot of sources. I brought one main source that puts it through very clearly, and that is the Hakdama of the Rambam to Yad HaChazaka. So we're going to read the Hakdama of the Rambam, understand some principles, discuss them, and then move on from there. So I'm going to share the screen with you. One moment. What do I do that it will? Okay. Fine. Okay. So this is the introduction of the Rambam to his Yad HaChazaka. And in this introduction, what the Rambam is actually doing, he wants to justify the writing of his book. And the question is, why did the Yad HaChazaka need to be written? What is the purpose of this book? So at the very end, he's going to describe the book itself, what he is doing. But first, he wants to explain why he's doing what he is about to tell us that he is doing. So I'll start from the end and I'll say what actually is the Yad HaChazaka. The Yad HaChazaka is basically, in the eyes of the Rambam took the entire Torah and basically put it in one book. That is what he sees to be doing in the Yad HaChazaka. Why is he doing that? Because he feels that the Torah in his days is no longer accessible as it used to be, and he fears that it is going to be lost, and therefore he does what he does. He puts one book that clearly puts the entire Torah. The entire Torah is clearly put there, and in a way that it is easily accessed because it is divided into categories, chapters, etc. Now, did the Yad HaChazaka turn into what the Rambam anticipated it would? No, no. And the first one to point it out, even before it is not going to happen, was the Ravid, as we are about to see. Because today, when we want to know the halacha, we don't open Rambam. And today, when we want to know Torah, we don't learn Rambam. We see the Rambam as one of the many books of the Torah, but we don't see it as the Torah. The Rambam called his book Mishneh Torah because in his mind, what you need is the Tanakh and his book, and you have it all. The Tanakh you need because it's Torah shebichtav, so it has holiness in the way it is written. But if you want to know the Torah in the sense of Torah shebe'al peh and what to do and how to act halachically, you have his Mishneh Torah, meaning the second Torah to Torah shebichtav, meaning you have Torah shebichtav, and his Mishneh Torah, which is Torah shebe'al peh, and that's it. Now, it's not me saying, he says it in this Hakdama, which we're about to read. But why did he think it is necessary to write such a book. So he gives us that in his introduction. And so he writes, Az lo evosh ba'abiti el kol mitzvotecha, that is his opening, and he starts, Kol ha'mitzvot shenitnu lo leMoshe v'Sinai, b'firushan nitnu. All commandments that was given to Moshe in Har Sinai were given to him with all their perushim, with the proper understanding of that mitzvah. So, for instance, I'll explain what he means. The Torah says that ukshatam leot al yadecha v'ayu letotafot beinenecha. What does that mean? Tie what on your arm? Put what as totafot between your eyes? Where is between your eyes? What is totafot? That is the meaning of the words, the perush. So also the perush was given in Moshe in Sinai. Shene'emar ve'etna lecha et luchot ha'even ve'haTorah ve'hamitzvah. Hashem gave him the tablets with the 10 commandments and the Torah and the mitzvah. What are the Torah and the mitzvah? Torah zo Torah shebichtav. That is the written Torah. Ve'hamitzvah zo perusha. And the mitzvah is the meaning of the Torah shebichtav, its explanation. And the explanation is given naturally by heart, because if it is given as a written explanation, you'll need another explanation of the explanation, that too by heart. V'tzivanu la'asot ha'Torah al pi ha'mitzvah. And he commanded us, Hashem commanded us to do the Torah according to its explanation. So coming to the example that I said before, Hashem tells us to tie something on our arms and to put something between our eyes, comes the explanation and tells us that something is the tefillin, and that tefillin has to be square and is made out of leather, and you put it on this place in the arm, and you tie it this way on your arm, and it is placed between the eyes. Between the eyes doesn't mean literally between the eyes, but it means on your forehead or above your forehead, in the middle, that it's against the between your eyes. And this is also, you put the parshiot, these are the parshiot that you put in, etc., etc. That is all the explanation. Mitzvah, this explanation. Zoyanikret Torah shebe'al peh. So we have both Torah shebichtav, Torah shebe'al peh, both given in Mount Sinai. And that is the beginning of everything. Then the Rambam goes on, and that I don't have here. You see the 3 dots. The 3 dots represent the Rambam's list of all generations who received from who. So part of it is written also in Masechet Avot, where the Rambam takes it from, and then it continues afterwards as well. But yes, so generation after generation, the leaders receive the tradition, and Beit Dino until we get to the Beit Din of Ezra. The Beit Din of Ezra came from Babel and established the second temple and the second commonwealth. So Beit Dino shel Ezra hem haninkraim anshei Knesset Hagdola. That wasn't just another Beit Din, that was a special Beit Din. That is called the Great Assembly. 120 zkenim. Altogether, there were 120 of them. Ha'acharon mehem hu Shimon HaTzadik. The last one to survive was Shimon HaTzadik. Whether this Great Assembly was a one generation thing or whether it was across a few generations, that is a discussion which the Rambam doesn't discuss here. But the end is Shimon HaTzadik. And of course, we know, the Rambam doesn't mention it here, but we know that many takanot, the way we have them today, were established by that special Beit Din, by Anshei Knesset Hagdola. The tefillot, we are told, were established by Anshei Knesset Hagdola. The brachot, the many brachot, were established by Anshei Knesset Hagdola. The many other mitzvot, as we know them today, were established by Anshei Knesset Hagdola. For instance, Shabbat, the way we keep it today. So, of course, the bare bones of Shabbat are given by the Torah. But according to the Torah, you are allowed to have commerce on Shabbat. Muktzeh, according to most opinions, is allowed. So Shabbat looked very, very different during before Ezra than after Ezra. Before Ezra, Shabbat was the day you went to the mall and you could have done everything whatever you want. You could have gone to the mall, you could have gone to the beach, you could have done everything that people do on their weekday off. We also could have done it on our Shabbat in the first temple days. Came Ezra and turned Shabbat into a very different day by introducing all kinds of siyagim la Torah. By that, turning Shabbat into what we know it today, into a day of gathering, of prayer, of tefillah, the tefillot that we say. We have muktzeh. We're not allowed to have commerce on Shabbat. So by that, Shabbat turns into the day that the Torah anticipated it to turn into. But Ezra puts the structure that allows it to socially develop into that religiously holy day. So that is one of the things. I brought Shabbat as an example, but many of those things are basically put forth by Ezra. So notice, and soon the Rambam will mention it, that now it is already not just the Torah and the Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh that were given in Har Sinai. Now it has developed even more than that, meaning the Great Assembly introduced new takanot to support the Torah, but they're new takanot. So for instance, not to allow commerce on Shabbat. That Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, he says how he's fighting with the merchants as they're coming to Yerushalayim because for them it was not just another, that was the market day. So he's fighting against it and is metaken all these takanot that you're not allowed it. That this is not allowed. So this is during the days of Ezra. And so from there, the Rambam continues, and there is these three dots throughout all the days of the Tanaim until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, name after name after name, the transmission of, and who was the head of the Sanhedrin. Sometimes they were the head of the Sanhedrin, sometimes they were the Abbeitim, whatever they were, until the days of Rabbi Yehuda bno shel Rabban Shimon. Rabban Shimon is not Shimon HaTzadik. We're talking about generations and generations later, a few centuries later. Rabbi Yehuda bno shel Rabban Shimon, zeu hanikra Rabbeinu HaKadosh, or Rebbe. Yes? והוא קיבל מאביו, ומרבי אלעזר בן שמוע, מרבי שמעון חבריו, רבינו הקדוש חיבר המשנה. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi then compiles what we know as the Mishnah. וממות משה רבינו ועד רבינו הקדוש לא חיברו חיבור שמלמדים אותו ברבים בתורה שבעל פה. Says the Rambam, from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu until the days of Rebbe, throughout all these generations of transmission, throughout the days of the Nevi'im, including the days of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, including all the many centuries later, nothing was written that is used as a common text to be taught to the public. Now notice this, שמלמדים אותו ברבים בתורה שבעל פה. However, other types of writings there were, אלא שבכל דור ודור, ראש בית דין או נביא שהיה באותו הדור, כותב לעצמו זיכרון השמועות ששמר מאבותיו, והוא מלמד על פה ברבים. It could be that there were some that when they heard shiurim, they wrote some of the, they took some notes to themselves. But that was notes that referred as personal references, meaning when he wanted to remember what exactly his rabbi said, he would refer to his notes that he wrote at the time. But when he would teach, he wouldn't give out a source sheet or something like that with these notes. That was unheard of. There is no public text that is being learned, but only the oral transmission, which is the Torah shebe'al peh. That is the way it is taught. But וכל אחד, וכן כל אחד ואחד כותב לעצמו כפי כוחו מביאור התורה ומהלכותיה כמו ששמע. ומדברים שנתחדשו בכל דור ודור בדינים שלא למדו מפי השמועה, אלא במידה מ-13 מידות והסכימו עליהם בית דין הגדול. Okay, now note what the Rambam is writing here. אלא בכל דור ודור. Okay, so the Rambam his focus here is on the writing, but that's okay. That's his focus. It doesn't have to be our focus. But as he is talking about the writing, he's saying what they are writing. So first they're writing, Zichron HaShmuot, here I'll put this, Sheshama Meravotav. So first of all, it's Zichron HaShmuot Sheshama Meravotav. What does that mean? That means things that he remembers, that, I'm sorry, not remembers, that he received from his rabbi. So that is the Torah Sheba'al Peh that the Rambam wrote about before. So it could be the Perush of the Torah, and it could be also the new takanot that we saw that the Beit Din of Ezra had said in as we saw. However, there is another part. וכן כל אחד ואחד כותב לעצמו כפי כוחו מביאור התורה ומהלכותיה כמו ששמע. Okay, this is already something else. What does that mean? This is not the same as before. He wrote זיכרון השמועות ששמע מרבותיו, but then כפי כוחו מביאור התורה ומהלכותיה כמו ששמע. So this is another, so in what sense is this the Rambam just repeating what he just said before? No, he's writing here something else. He's saying, when the Torah, so there are the Shmuot Sheshama Merabotav, and then there is Be'ur HaTorah U'Meilchotea Kemo Sheshama. So Shmuot Sheshama, that is things that are not necessarily connected to the Torah, Shebichtav. So, for instance, Netilat Yadayim. Okay, so Beit Din of Shlomo were metaken Netilat Yadayim. Netilat Yadayim is not written anywhere in the Torah. It is not a perush to the Torah. It is a new thing. Or as I said before, the halachot that are siyag la Torah but are also not written in the Torah. Muktzeh, not to have commerce on Shabbat. All of those things are not perushim in the Torah. These are things that are orally transmitted. These are takanot that were established in Beit Din and are transmitted. Now, in addition, there is Be'ur Torah. Okay, the explanation of the Torah. That goes back to what I said before. So the putting on of the tefillin, what exactly is the tefillin? How does it look like? What is it made of? What does it have in it? When do you put it on? All of those things, that is Be'ur Torah. That is also written privately by some people. Okay, now the third thing is umidvarim shenitchadshu bechol dor vador bedinim shelo lemadu mipi hashmuah ela bemidah mishlosh-esra midot vehiskimu aleihem beit din hagadol. This is a bit long, but this, just a minute. What is this? This third element is, okay, we did not receive any, it is not talking about an explanation that was received by tradition, but we received the text, and we are reading the text, and by logical deduction or induction, we get to certain conclusions that we did not accept or receive from previous generations, but that seemed to us as a logical conclusion. So, for instance, we learn something in Kal Vachomer, and my rabbi never taught me this specific Kal Vachomer, okay? But it seems to me that it would make sense. So that I bring that forth. Now, the fact that I think that doesn't make it halakha. I could be a great rabbi that thinks that. That doesn't make it halakha. But what makes it halakha? This. Vehiskimu aleihem beit din hagadol. This turns it into halakha. How does it turn it into halakha? I come up with a thought. I look at something and I say, you know, if this is true, then how more so this should be true. But you know, no one ever told us that, but it makes perfect sense to me. So I go and I present that argument in front of Beit Din Hagadol, and the Beit Din Hagadol sits down there with the 71 members of the Beit Din HaGadol, and they all say, you know, this idea which you came up with makes perfect sense. And therefore, it is probably what the Torah meant. So we are now accepting this as part of the body of the Torah. This is what the Torah meant. So we have three elements that the Rambam put here to Torah Shebe'al Peh so far. The Shmuot Sheshama Merabotav, these are edicts that are established by Torah institutions, by the Beit Din HaGadol throughout the generations and transmitted. And then Be'ur HaTorah, meaning the explanation of the Torah Shebichtav as it is received from the previous generation. And then the third element are novelties that are reached by logical conclusions of reading the text of Torah Shebichtav. All these three elements are the body of Torah Shebe'al Peh and are so transmitted from one generation to the other. Okay, that is up to the days of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. All of these three elements continue to be transmitted as they are from generation to generation orally. There was no fixed text that was recognized as an authoritative reference. There was no written authoritative reference, only Torah Shebe'al Peh. However, Rebbe then decides to put it all down in writing, and now the written text becomes the authority. Why? ולמה עשה רבינו הקדוש כך, ולא הניח הדבר כמות שהיה, לפי שראה שתלמידים מתמעטים והולכים, והצרות מתחדשות ובאות, ומלכות רומי פושטת בעולם ומתגברת. What Rebbe sees is that times are changing. And history is now, we're going through, where this is, Rebbe is seeing that we're going through a rough patch inside, and we have both internal and external challenges. Internally, the Talmidim mitma'atim ve'olchim. Yes, there are less students, less are going into law, less are coming to the academy to learn Torah, to learn law, and therefore transmit it to the next generation. So there are fewer, and if there are fewer, so they're probably, it's not only in quantity, the diminishing or the decline is also in quality, and that is internally. Why? Probably because the economy wasn't. When you have a good economy and people are comfortable, then people can engage in matters that are not day-to-day life. But if I have to get up in the morning and go and take care of because I need to take care of my parnasai, I barely make a living, so to go and learn Torah in addition to it, or to send my son to go and learn Torah, is almost impossible. So that's one thing. The economy is bad, so people are not coming to learn. And ומלכות רומי פושטת בעולם ומתגברת. And also the great empire, the Roman Empire, is gaining power, and that means that there are external matters that make it more difficult to keep and learn the Torah. וישראל מתגלגלים והולכים לקצוות, and the people of Israel are now dispersed all over the world. So now to maintain one law, one body of law that will be for everyone becomes impossible if that body of law is going to remain orally, an oral body. Why? Because now I have Jews in Rome, I have Jews in Babylon, and I have Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Those are the three big centers, but there are many smaller centers, even during the days of Rebbe, right? We know that Reb Meir comes from Asia Minor. We know that other rabbis, we have Alexandria, of course. We have Jews all over, dispersed all over the world. Now, if we are going to have rabbis in Rome teaching their students, and rabbis in Babylon teaching their students, and in Alexandria their students, in Eretz Yisrael their students, then slowly these traditions that are transmitted orally are going to change because inevitably an oral tradition changes over time. And this is a very important thing to recognize and understand. And perhaps this is one of the it could be that this is an advantage if we want that oral transmission has over written transmission. The Gra, Rabbi Eliyahu Mivilna, is quoted by his Talmid, Reb Mendel Misheklov, as saying that Torah shebe'al peh mithapechet kachotam. Torah shebe'al peh can change in 180 degrees through the generations. Why? Because when we transmit it orally, let's take for instance, Torah shebichtav, we have the mitzvah of Mechiyat Amalek. Now that mitzvah survived the generations and it came into our generation 3,300 and something years after it was put there in the Torah by Moshe Rabbeinu out of the mouth of Hashem. Now, what if there was no Torah shebe'al peh? There was only Torah shebichtav. Then, as the moral sentiment would have changed, then the Talmid who hears that mitzvah from his rabbi would change it a bit. He would understand it slightly differently. And throughout the generations, and it's generation after generation after generation, there would be every time a slight change in that mitzvah. After 3,300 years, when it would have gotten to our generations, that mitzvah wouldn't have been there. To take a people and annihilate them with their babies, that mitzvah wouldn't be there because it would have changed throughout the generations. However, because it is written black ink over white parchment, there is no way of that mitzvah going away because it's there. Meaning the written word gives it a sense of, meaning it sets it in stone in such a way that even though I might implement it differently from one generation to another, but I'm confronted by that mitzvah even 3,300 years later, it is still there. Now I have to break my head how to deal with it. I have to think how am I going to deal with that mitzvah that I perceive today as immoral. I have to deal with that. But that mitzvah is there nonetheless. However, if that is the way Torah shebe'al peh is transmitted, meaning I recognize the fact that Torah shebe'al peh changes over time, as the Gra says, if I have more than one center that transmits Torah shebe'al peh, then inevitably, give it a few generations, and you will have more than one Torah. Because the center in Alexandria will say X, the center in Babylonia will say Y, and the center in Eretz Yisrael will say something altogether different. And the Jewish people are no longer one people because they don't have one Torah. So Rebbe wants to avoid that, and therefore chiber chibur echad lihiyot biyad kulam kedei shilmedu b'meira velo yishakach. That is what he says, in order for it not to be forgotten and in order for it to be one thing that everyone agrees upon. And then the Rambam goes on and brings another list of other books that were written by the disciples of Rebbe, Rav Chiber Safra v'Sifri, levaer uleodia ikarei HaMishnah, ורבי חייא חיבר התוספתא, לברר ענייני המשנה, וכן רבי יושעיה ובר כפרה חיברו בריתות לבאר דברי המשנה. So we have many books that are written by the students of Rebbe to expand and explain the Mishnah and its principles. Then later, a few generations later, ורבי יוחנן חיבר הגמרא ירושלמית בארץ ישראל אחר חורבן הבית בקרוב 300 שנה. Okay, so Rebbe writes the Mishnah more or less 150 years after the destruction of the temple. And more or less 150 years after that, meaning 300 years after the destruction, more or less, we're talking about mid 4th century, yes, Rabbi Yochanan compiles the Talmud Yerushalmi. Okay, so that is in Eretz Israel. Then Ravina v'Ravashi, okay, here the Rambam goes on to give the whole chain of transmission as it was during the days of the Amoraim, one generation after the other. And then at the very end of the days of the Gemara, says the Rambam, at this point, Ravina v'Ravashi, hem sof chachmei HaGemara, are the last of the sages of the Gemara. V'Rav hu shechiber HaGemara bavlit be'eretz Shin'ar. Rav is the one who compiled the Babylonian Gemara in Babylon. Achar shechiber Rabbi Yochanan HaGemara Yerushalmi, Yerushalmi b'chmo 100 shana, about 100 years after Rabbi Yochanan compiled the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, the Jerusalem Talmud was not compiled in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a non-Jewish city those days, not called Yerushalayim, but Ilya Capitolina. Jews were not allowed to live there, but it is called Yerushalmi because we do not forget Yerushalayim. So we always, we do not forget Yerushalayim. So even though it was compiled most likely in Tveria, in the north, it is called Talmud Yerushalmi. As I said, mid 4th century, something like that. Mid 5th century, about 100 years later, says the Rambam, in Babylon, Ravina and Ravashi compile, or Ravashi compiles the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli. בעניין שתי הגמרות ופירוש דברי המשניות וביאור עמקותיה ודברים שנתחדשו בכל בית דין ובית דין ממות רבנו הקדוש ועד חיבור הגמרא. Now, in the Gemara, let's pay attention to what the Rambam just said. The Rambam tells us here that there are two elements to the Gemara. Yeah. The one is Peirush Divrei HaMishnayot Uve'ur Amkutea. Okay, it's an explanation of the Mishnah and discussing its deepness, meaning going in it in depth. But then the second thing is, so that's the explanation of the Mishnah, to understand what the Mishnah is saying. But the Gemara has another thing, and that is, Udvarim shenitchadshu bechol beit din vebeit din mimot Rabbeinu HaKadosh v'ad chibur HaGemara. There were still batei din. Since the days of Rebbe, when he compiled the Mishnah, and until the days of Ravina, there were still new laws that were legislated. There were new takanot, dvarim shenitchadshu. Okay? So, dvarim shenitchadshu are new laws and new understandings as well. Because as you remember before, there is the new laws, the edicts of the Batei Din, and there are also dinim shelo lemadu mipi hashmona ela b'mida mi13 midot, new logical understandings of the Torah. And that continues after Rebbe. After Rebbe learns the Mishnah, the rabbis still read the Torah and deduce and induce and understand logically, try to extract a new halachot. And they also legislate halachot, takanot, not related to halachot in the Torah, but new takanot. Like such examples last week. I'll show. Let's look in this Sefer Takanot that we have. So we have. Let's look at one, just for as an example. I want to bring a good example that puts this. Okay, we have here, just a minute. Sorry, I put a simania in the book, but I lost it, so I'll just find it. Mm. No, I'm sorry. I lost the. Okay, never mind. Never mind. But the word takanot that later are mentioned in the Gemara, we don't need to go through a specific one right now. So, ve'inyan. Okay. So these are the things that are written until the end of the days of Ravina v'Rav Ashi. Umimei hagmarot, ומשני הגמרות ומן התוספתות ומספרא וספרי, מכולם מתבהר האסור והמותר, הטמא והטהור, החיוב והפטור, הפסול והכשר, כמו שהעתיקו איש מפי איש, מפי משה רבינו מסיני. Okay, וגם, okay, so he says, from all these books that we have so far, we have Mishnah, Safra, Sifri, all these books that the Rambam mentioned, and of course the two Gemarot, the two Talmudim, Talmud Bavi and Talmud Yerushalmi. From them, we יתבאר האסור והמותר, הטמא והטהור, החיוב והפטור, הפסול הכשר, כמו שהעתיקו איש מפי איש, מפי משה רבינו מסיני. So first of all, it has the element of Torah שבעל פה, the tradition that we have from Moshe Rabbeinu. But then the second part is גם יתבהר מהם דברים שגזרו חכמים ונביאים שבכל דור ודור לעשות סייג לתורה. As we said before, things new takanot and edicts, like muktzeh, like not having commerce on Shabbat, etc. וכן יתבהר מהם המנהגות והתקנות שהתקינו או שנהגו. Okay. Now, these are two separate things. There is things that are put as siyag laTorah. So the Torah tells us about Shabbat. Come Ezra and his Beit Din, and they want Shabbat to work, to be what the Torah anticipated to be. So they introduce new laws to strengthen and enhance the Shabbat experience and value. Okay, so that is one type of takanot. But then there is, וכן יתבהר מהם המנהגות והתקנות שהתקינו או שנהגו בכל דור ודור, כמו שראו בית דין של אותו הדור. There are edicts and laws and regulations which are introduced not because we found something in the Torah, but because they make sense to that Beit Din to introduce. So the Beit Din, the Beit Din Hagadol, the 71 Chachamim, that let's say are in Yerushalayim during the days of Beit HaMikdash, or that are elsewhere, soon we'll see where, they think that it will make sense to have a new takana. So for instance, that if there is a shop, there is such a takana, right? In the Gemara discusses it. If there is a shop in one street and someone new moves into that street and opens the same kind of shop, is he allowed to? No, he's not allowed to, because he is yored lechayei chavero. Two shops of the same kind are not able to be in the same street, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. That is a takana. What is that connected to? To what mitzvah in the Torah? No particular mitzvah. It is just something that makes sense, and therefore to allow proper life and a good and the good, just society, חכמים are מתקן such הלכות. וכן משפטים ודינים מופלאים שלא קיבלו ממשה ודנו בהם בית דין של אותו הדור במידות שהתורה נדרשת בהם. Again, new understandings of the Torah that we reach through logical deduction, ופסקו אותם הזקנים וגמרו שהדין כך הוא, הכל חיבר רב אשי בגמרא ממות משה עד ימיו. Okay, so he says all of that is in the Gemara together with the other chiburim that he mentioned before. That's all in the Gemara. Says the Rambam here, נמצא רבינה ורב אשי וחבריהם סוף גדולי חכמי ישראל המעתיקים תורה שבעל פה. Ravina and Rav Ashi and the other rabbis in their generations, they conclude an era. What era? The Ma'atikim Torah Shebe'al Peh, those who wrote down Torah Shebe'al Peh. Okay, that on the one hand. And in addition, they are the end of those שגזרו גזירות והתקינו התקנות והנהיגו מנהגות ופשטה גזירתם ותקנתם ומנהגותם בכל ישראל בכל מקומות מושבותם. Ravina and Rav Ashi's Beitin is the last Beitin in history that put forth new edicts, basically that legislated, and that legislation was accepted by the entirety of Israel, bechol Israel, bekol mekomot moshvotam, everywhere, and they were the last Beitin. From then, their days onwards, there is no other Beitin that has the power to do that. ואחר בית של רב אשי שחיבר הגמרא וגמרו בימי בנו נתפזרו ישראל בכל הארצות פיזור יתר. Okay, from those days, the galut is to such an extent that there is no longer, there are no longer able to have one beitin that is for everyone. והגיעו לקצוות ועם הריחותיקים ורבתה קטטה בעולם ונשתבשו הדרכים בגייסות ונטמא תלמוד תורה ולא נכנסו ישראל ללמוד בישיבותיהם אלפים ורבבות. So the decline that began during the days of Rebbe, that prompted him to write the Mishnah, comes to its final stage during the days or right after Ravina and Rav Ashi. Now it's no longer, travel is not easy anymore, and you cannot get from one center to another. And now you can't have one beitin that is going to decide for the entirety of Am Yisrael. Because if we decide one thing in Bavel, it won't reach other parts of the world. The connections are just not there. So what are we going to do? We're all going to work with this Talmud Bavli. That is going to be our basis. And now each place has its own beitin, and every beitin could do takanot. But those takanot of a particular beitin do not have authority over other regions which are beyond their reach. So we don't have one center beitin anymore. And this happens only in the days of Ravina and Rav Ashi. So look here. Until centuries later, centuries after the Chuban, there is still one Torah center, one institution that has the power to legislate for the entirety of the people of Israel until the days of Ravina and Rav Ashi, mid-5th century. Yes, 400 years after Churban Abayit. Only then, we don't, that is lost during the days of Rav Ashi. So you see that a decline that in some way started even before Churban Abayit, Sanhedrin galta mirushalayim veyashva bechanut. We saw that last week or 2 weeks ago, I don't remember when. So meaning Sanhedrin stopped giving capital punishment before Churban Abayit. And Sanhedrin and the Beit Din Agadol in the Beit Din in Babylon didn't see itself as having the power to ladun dinei knasot, to enforce fines, but only some of the halachot, not all of them. But even though they didn't have those powers, they still were a legislative institution. They still had powers to legislate for the entirety of Am Yisrael until 400 years after Churban Abayit. So we see this gradual decline that comes to a very important stage with the Chatimat HaTalmud. But then it continues. Okay, so after that we have the Geonim. Now says the Rambam, the Geonim are still one center, and they still have the power. They're an authoritative voice in explaining and interpreting the Talmud. Until when? Until the days of the Rambam. The Rambam says now they're no longer an authoritative voice. Now I could decide that I don't agree with the Gaon that is sitting in Baghdad. There was still a Gaon in Baghdad during the days of the Rambam. Now, the truth is it didn't start with the Rambam. It started about a century beforehand, right? With the rabbis of the Rambam. And in Tzofat, we had Rabbeinu Gershom Meor HaGolah, the Clonimus family, and the later Rashi, and the Baalei Tosfot, and in Sfarad we had the Rif and Rabbeinu Hananel, and until the Rimigash, and it comes to the Rambam, and then others, and all of a sudden there are these great centers that are outside of Bavel, and now, so up until the end of the days of the Talmud, at least, so we don't have the center lost its legislative power, but it still had an authority in terms of interpreting the tradition. The Geonim still had that power until about the 9th century, the 10th century. Only in the 10th century, so for about 500 years, we still have the Geonim running tradition, basically. They're writing letters everywhere, so they cannot legislate, but they do have authority in terms of interpreting. But even that is lost during the days of the Rishonim. We have to stop here in the middle. I hope to. It's not in the middle. We're almost finished, but we'll have to finish it next week. I was hoping to finish this week and to get to the next stage, but we'll continue next week. So what we saw today, I'll just conclude in a few words. What we saw today is the Rambam putting in his introduction to Mishneh Torah the gradual decline of what we may call, on the one hand, Torah Shebe'al Peh, but if we want to focus on it from another perspective, the decline of the legal Jewish institutions, meaning starting with the Beit Din Hagadol that was there, that was from Anshei Knesset Hagdolah, that received from Moshe Rabbeinu, etc., and then we see the gradual decline throughout the generations until the days of Ravina and Ravashi, where they lost the power to legislate, and after that even lost the power to interpret, and now we are at the days of the Rambam, where it seems that anarchy is beginning to prevail, and this is what the Rambam is coming to save us from, and that we'll see next week, Be'ezrat Hashem. So we'll end here and continue next week, and we'll go on a break now and be back in 10 minutes for the next session at 12 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.